The dust tasted of endings. Lottie had been swallowing it for 3 days, a fine grit that coated her tongue and settled in her soul. It was the taste of a life left behind in a hurry, the taste of a future she was running toward with no map and no water. The white dress, once a symbol of a transaction she'd refused to honor, was now a tattered flag of surrender to the wilderness. Its lace hem was snagged with burrs and stained with mud. It was a fool's garment for this country. She was a fool. But she was a free fool, and that was something. She had walked away from the church, from the heavy-handed man named Jasper Croft, whose breath smelled of stale cigars and ownership. She had walked right past her father's pleading eyes, eyes that had sold her for the price of his gambling debts. She just kept walking, out of the small Ohio town, past the last fence, and into the vast, unknowable West. The stagecoach ticket had taken her last few coins, and the driver had left her at a dusty crossroads called Redemption, a name so cruel it felt like a joke. From there, she had only her own 2 feet. Now, her feet were blistered and bleeding inside the foolish satin slippers that were never meant for anything but gliding across a polished floor. Thirst was a constant, clawing companion. Hunger was a dull ache she'd almost grown used to. She stumbled upon the line shack by sheer luck, a half-collapsed structure of weathered gray boards hunkered down against a low rise, looking as weary and abandoned as she felt. The door hung on one leather hinge. Inside, it smelled of dry rot, old smoke, and mouse droppings. But it was shelter. It was 4 walls, however broken, between her and the enormous, indifferent sky. She collapsed onto the dirt floor, the ruined dress pooling around her like dirty snow. Sleep was not a gentle drift, but a fall from a great height. When she woke, the world was painted in the deep oranges and purples of a frontier sunset. The silence was absolute, broken only by the whisper of wind through dry grass. This was the loneliest place she had ever been. Lonelier than her mother's sick room. Lonelier than the years after, listening to her father's excuses. Here, the loneliness was clean. It didn't have walls or a ceiling. It was as big as the land itself. For 2 days, she survived. A trickle of murky water from a nearly dry creek bed. A handful of bitter berries that made her stomach cramp, but filled the hollow space for a while. She was becoming a creature of the land, shedding the girl who was meant to be a merchant's wife and finding someone leaner, harder, underneath. On the 3rd morning at the shack, a new sound broke the silence. It was a sound of panic, a frantic crashing noise from a thicket of scrub oak and thorn brush down by the creek. It was followed by a scream of pure animal rage and terror. Something in her, the part that was still soft, that hadn't yet been baked out by the sun, responded to the sound of distress. She moved toward it cautiously, her bare arms scraped by thorns. And then she saw him. A stallion, black as coal and built like a storm cloud, was hopelessly tangled in the thorny branches. His left hind leg was caught fast in a twisted root, and the more he fought, the deeper the thorns dug into his hide. Blood, dark and stark, slicked his powerful flanks. His eyes were wide with white-rimmed terror. He was magnificent, and he was doomed. She stopped. Any sane person would have backed away. A horse that size, that wild and that panicked, could kill a person with a single kick. But Lottie had never been particularly sane, not by the world's measure. Her mother, a woman who could coax secrets from the earth and calm the most skittish of creatures, had taught her things. Not with words, but with a stillness, a way of breathing that said, "I am not a threat. I am part of the quiet." Lottie sank to the ground, making herself small. She didn't look directly at the horse's eyes. She looked at the ground, at a dusty beetle making its slow way across a stone. She began to hum, a low, tuneless sound from the back of her throat. It was a melody her mother used to use when a foal was scared or a hen wouldn't settle. It was a sound that meant peace. The stallion's frantic movements slowed. He stilled, watching her, his great chest heaving, nostrils flaring. He snorted, a blast of hot, dusty air. She didn't move. She just hummed. For an hour she sat there, the sun beating on the back of her neck. Slowly, inch by agonizing inch, she began to move closer, never rising from her crouch. She spoke to him, her voice as soft as the hum. "Easy now, big fellow. Easy. You've gotten yourself into a fine mess. Let's see about getting you out of it." He trembled as she got closer, his muscles bunched and ready to explode into another frenzy of struggle. But he didn't. Her calm was a blanket, settling over his panic. She could see the wound on his leg now. It was deep, torn open by the root. He would lose the leg, or his life, if he wasn't freed soon. With painstaking slowness, she reached into the pocket of her ruined dress and pulled out the only tool she had, a small sewing knife, forgotten from a mending kit. It was pitifully small for the task. She showed it to him, her palm open. "Just a little cut," she murmured. "Just the root. Then you can be free." She edged closer still, until she could smell the horse sweat and the blood, a wild, metallic scent. He could have crushed her skull. Instead, he blew a soft breath through his nose that stirred the stray hairs at her temple. He was letting her in. It took another hour of careful, patient work, sawing at the tough, gnarled root with the tiny blade. Her hands were raw, her fingers cramping. The stallion stood impossibly still, his trust a fragile, precious thing she held in her hands along with the knife. Finally, with a snap, the root gave way. The horse flinched but didn't pull back. His leg was free. He stood, trembling, favoring the wounded limb, and looked at her. It wasn't a look of gratitude, not in any human sense. It was a look of acknowledgement. He saw her. She tore a long strip from the petticoat of her dress, soaked it in the creek, and gently, carefully, washed the dirt and blood from the gash. He let her. He stood like a stone monument as she bound the wound with another strip of cloth. When she was done, she backed away slowly. He took a hesitant step, then another. He was hurt, but he was free. He could have bolted, vanished back into the wilderness that had spawned him. He didn't. He lowered his massive head and nudged her shoulder, a gesture so gentle it made her want to weep. She found a length of frayed rope in the abandoned shack, likely a lead left behind years ago. She made a loose loop of it, and holding it out, she walked toward him again. He watched her approach, his dark eyes intelligent. He could have been miles away in the time it took her to reach him. But he waited. He lowered his head and allowed her to slip the rope over his neck. And together, the girl in the ruined white dress and the wild stallion who belonged to no one, they began to walk. She didn't know where she was going, only that she was leading a miracle. The ranch headquarters appeared over a rise, a cluster of buildings that looked like they'd grown out of the earth itself. A long, low ranch house, a massive barn, corrals, and a bunkhouse. It was a kingdom of dust and timber and hard work. As she and the stallion crested the hill, a man on the porch of the main house froze, a coffee cup halfway to his lips. Another man, mending a harness near the barn, dropped his tools with a clatter. One by one, the work on the ranch ground to a halt. They were all staring. Lottie kept walking, her heart a slow, heavy drum in her chest. The stallion walked beside her, his limp pronounced, but his head held high. He was home, and he knew it. She was a stranger, and she knew that too. She walked him right up to the main corral gate, her bare feet dusty, her dress a ghostly spectacle. The man on the porch set his cup down with a deliberate click and walked to meet her. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, with a face that looked like it had been carved from the same hard landscape he ruled. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, missed nothing. He didn't look at her, not at first. His gaze was fixed on the horse, a mixture of disbelief and something else. Something deeper and more painful. "Chaos," he said, his voice a low rumble. It wasn't a question. He ran a hand down the stallion's neck, checking the wound on his leg with an expert touch. Only then did his eyes lift to meet hers. She saw power in them, and loneliness. She saw a man who was used to being in charge, and who was not accustomed to surprises. "He's been gone 3 weeks," the man said, his voice flat, betraying no emotion. "We had men searching from here to the territories, gave him up for dead." "He was caught in a thicket down by the creek," Lottie said, her own voice sounding thin and reedy to her ears. "His leg was trapped." The man, Nate, looked from her to the simple rope looped around the stallion's neck. He knew this horse. Chaos had thrown every man on the ranch, himself included. He was a force of nature, not an animal to be led like a milk cow. And this wisp of a woman, looking more like a spirit than a person, had walked him home. "Who are you?" he asked. The question was sharp, demanding. "My name is Lottie," she said, lifting her chin. She was tired, hungry, and had nothing left to lose. "I was just passing through." Nate looked at her torn dress, her blistered feet, the exhaustion etched into her face. He saw a woman on the run, a woman at the end of her rope. But he also saw the woman who had brought back the one thing he had thought was lost for good. It went against every instinct he had. His life was walled off, protected. He didn't let strays in, not animals and certainly not people. But he couldn't turn her away. Not after this. "The cook needs help in the kitchen," he said, the words clipped. "And there's a room off the pantry. It's small, but it's clean." It wasn't an offer of kindness, it was a transaction. He was buying the answer to a question he didn't know how to ask. How did you do it? How did you touch the one thing I couldn't hold on to? He turned and walked back toward the house without waiting for her answer, calling over his shoulder. "Jed, see to the horse, and find her something to wear that isn't that." A wiry, mean-faced hand named Jed sauntered over, his eyes lingering on Lottie with a sneer. He reached for the rope, but chaos flattened his ears and snapped his teeth, the whites of his eyes showing. Jed jumped back, cursing. The stallion would let no one but Lottie near him. She gentled him with a hand on his neck, murmuring softly, and led him into the corral herself. Nate watched from the porch, his face unreadable. He had offered her a job. What he didn't know was that he had just let a crack form in the wall he had spent years building around his heart. The room off the pantry was little more than a closet with a cot, but to Lottie, it was a palace. It had a door that latched. After a meal of beans and cornbread that tasted like the finest feast, and after washing the grime from her skin with a basin of cold water, she fell onto the lumpy mattress and slept for 12 straight hours. She woke to the smell of coffee and bacon and the sounds of a working ranch. She was safe. For now. Her days fell into a rhythm. She helped Martha, the stout, no-nonsense cook, from before sunrise until after sunset. She peeled potatoes, scrubbed floors, and washed laundry until her hands were raw. She spoke little, and the hands mostly ignored her. The strange woman in a borrowed calico dress who had appeared out of nowhere with the boss's prize stallion. They called her the ghost bride behind her back. Jed, in particular, made his resentment clear, bumping into her in the yard, making comments just loud enough for her to hear. But every evening, when her work was done, she would slip out to the corral. Chaos would be waiting for her, nickering softly as she approached. She would clean and dress his wound, which was slowly beginning to heal. She would talk to him, telling him things she told no one else, about her mother's garden, about the books she used to read, about the suffocating weight of Jasper Croft's gaze. The horse would listen, his head resting on her shoulder, a silent, powerful confidant. Nate often watched from the shadows of the porch, a silent observer of this strange communion. He saw how the untamable horse grew gentle under her touch, how a deep and abiding trust had formed between them. It unnerved him. It reminded him of a tenderness he had buried long ago with his wife, Sarah. One afternoon, a commotion erupted from the breaking pen. A young filly, orphaned when a cougar took her mother, was fighting for her life against the ropes. She was small but wiry, all panicked eyes and flashing hooves. The hands were trying to get a halter on her, but she bit and kicked with a fury that belied her size. "Useless animal," Jed spat, backing away after a near miss. "Might as well put her down." Nate stood by the fence, his jaw tight. He hated to lose an animal, but the filly was dangerous. "Leave her," he commanded. "Let her be." Lottie, who had been on her way to the spring house, stopped. She watched the terrified filly trembling in the center of the pen. Without a word, she unlatched the gate and slipped inside, closing it quietly behind her. The men fell silent. Nate tensed, ready to shout at her to get out. But he didn't. He watched. Lottie didn't approach the horse. She walked to the far side of the pen and sat down in the dust, her back against the rails. She didn't look at the filly. She picked up a handful of dirt, letting it run through her fingers, her movements slow and calm. The filly watched her, snorting, ready to bolt. Lottie began to hum, the same low, soothing sound she had used with Chaos. For an hour, nothing happened. The sun beat down. The ranch hands, drawn by the spectacle, leaned against the fence, whispering. Jed scoffed. Waste of time. But Nate stayed, his gaze unwavering. He saw the patience, the absolute stillness she possessed. Slowly, the filly's trembling subsided. Her ears, once pinned back in fear, began to flicker forward with curiosity. She took a hesitant step toward the quiet woman, then another. She stretched out her nose, sniffing at Lottie's worn boot. Lottie didn't move a muscle. The filly nudged her arm, a gentle, questioning touch. Only then did Lottie slowly, so slowly lift her hand, not to touch, but simply to offer it, palm up. The filly lipped at her fingers, then rested her muzzle in her hand. A collective breath was released by the men at the fence. Lottie began to stroke the filly's neck, her touch as light as a butterfly's wing. The horse, who had been a whirlwind of terror moments before, closed her eyes and leaned into the touch. Lottie rose slowly and walked to the gate. The filly followed her like a shadow. Lottie opened the gate and walked out, and the filly followed her right into the main corral, sticking close to her side. She had done it again. She had proven that what happened with Chaos was no fluke. It was a gift. A quiet, powerful strength that no man on that ranch possessed. Jed stared, his face a mask of sour disbelief. The other men looked at her with a new, grudging respect. Nate looked at her and felt that crack in his wall widen into a chasm. He turned and walked back to the house, the silence he wrapped around himself feeling thinner than ever before. The slow burn of their connection was lit not by words, but by gestures. One morning, Lottie woke in her small room to find a sturdy pair of work boots outside her door. They were old, but the leather was well oiled and the soles were sound. They were far too big, but she stuffed the toes with rags and wore them gratefully, the foolish slippers finally discarded. She knew who had left them. She saw Nate glance at her feet later that day, a flicker of something in his eyes before he looked away. Another time, he found her in the barn late at night, painstakingly mending one of his work shirts by the dim light of a lantern. The needlework was fine and even, a skill from another life. He didn't say anything, just stood there for a moment, watching the way the light caught in her hair. The next evening, a new lantern with a full reservoir of oil and a clean chimney sat on the crate she used as a table. He never mentioned it. She never thanked him. the space between them filled with these unspoken kindnesses. He began to talk to her, not just about the ranch, but small things. He told her the name of the hawk that circled overhead each afternoon. She told him how to tell if rain was coming by the smell of the dust. They were two solitary people, slowly learning the language of each other's silence. She saw the grief he carried, a weight that settled in his shoulders and carved lines around his mouth. He saw the fear she hid behind her quiet competence, a wariness in her eyes that never fully disappeared. The town matriarch, Mrs. Gable, a woman whose piety was as starched and stiff as her collars, made her disapproval known. She would watch Lottie from the seat of her buggy when she came to visit the ranch, her lips pursed into a thin line of judgment. "A woman with no people is a woman with no history," she said to Nate one afternoon, loud enough for Lottie to hear from the porch. "And a woman with no history is a woman with secrets." Nate had simply replied, "Her history is her own business, Mrs. Gable." The dismissal had been curt, final, and it had been a defense of her. Lottie had felt it like a warm hand on her back. The moment that changed everything happened during a sudden thunderstorm. The sky turned a bruised purple and unleashed a torrent of rain and lightning. A young gelding, new to the ranch, panicked in its stall, kicking at the walls, threatening to break a leg. Lottie, hearing the commotion, ran from the kitchen into the deluge, pulling her thin shawl over her head. She slipped into the barn, her voice already a low murmur of reassurance. Nate was right behind her. "Lottie, get out of there! He'll kill you!" he yelled over the crash of thunder. But she was already at the stall door, speaking to the terrified animal. As she reached to unlatch the door, a bolt of lightning struck a massive oak near the barn, the crack of it like the world splitting in two. The gelding screamed and reared, his front hooves crashing against the stall door, splintering the wood. Nate lunged, grabbing Lottie by the waist and pulling her back just as a hoof smashed through the very spot where she had been standing. He pulled her hard against his chest, shielding her body with his own. For a long moment they stood there, frozen, the only sound the drumming of the rain on the roof and the frantic panting of the horse. Lottie could feel the solid, steady beat of his heart against her back. She could feel the strength in the arms that held her, a strength that felt less like a cage and more like an anchor. She leaned into it, just for a second, and felt a sense of safety she hadn't known was possible. He held her for a breath longer than was necessary. The danger had passed, but neither of them moved. His grip on her arms was firm, possessive. He was breathing hard, not from exertion, but from fear. Fear for her. Then, as if realizing what he was doing, he released her abruptly and stepped back, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "You should be more careful," he said, his voice rough. He turned and strode out of the barn, back into the rain, leaving her with the ghost of his touch on her skin and the undeniable truth that something had irrevocably shifted between them. The need he felt for her was now a terrifying, undeniable thing, and the walls he had built were crumbling to dust. The threat arrived on a Tuesday, in a polished black buggy that was entirely out of place in the dusty main street of Redemption. A man in a fine wool suit stepped out, a man whose soft hands and cruel mouth Lottie would have recognized in her darkest nightmares. It was Jasper Croft. He had tracked her. The fragile piece she had built for herself shattered like glass. Croft didn't come to the ranch at first. He was smarter than that. He went to the town, to the saloon, to the mercantile. He bought drinks and told a sad story of a beloved, simple-minded young wife who had taken fright before their wedding and wandered off. He painted himself as a worried husband, desperate to bring his dear, confused bride home where she would be safe. He had papers, a marriage contract, signed and witnessed. He showed it to the sheriff, a man who respected the law above all else. He showed it to Mrs. Gable, who nodded sympathetically, her worst suspicions about the woman at the ranch seemingly confirmed. It was Jed who sealed her fate. Nursing a grudge and a glass of cheap whiskey, he sought out Croft in the saloon. For the price of a few gold coins, he told Croft everything. He told him about the ghost bride at the Callaway ranch, the woman who charmed horses and had the boss acting like a moon-eyed calf. He told him Nate Callaway was a hard man, but a man who respected the law. The news came to the ranch like a sickness. One of the hands, a kinder man named Silas, rode back from town with the story. Lottie was in the yard, brushing down the filly when he told Nate. She saw the way Nate's body went rigid, the way his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Her blood ran cold. He knew. Her past had found her. She didn't wait for him to confront her. She went to him in the study, where he stood staring out the window at the distant mountains, his back to her. "It's true," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "His name is Jasper Croft, my father. He made an arrangement. I ran." Nate turned slowly. The warmth that had begun to grow between them was gone, replaced by the cold, hard mask he had worn when she first arrived. "He has a contract, Lottie, a legal document. The law says I am his property," she stated, a bitter taste in her mouth. "Like a horse or a chair. It does not ask if I agree." "And do you?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Do you belong to him?" She met his gaze, and for the first time she let him see all the way into the terror she had been hiding. "I belong to myself," she said, "and I will not go back with him. I'd die first." The silence in the room was heavy, thick with the impossible choice that lay between them. He was a man of property, a man who had built an empire on contracts and handshakes and the rule of law. To defy Croft would be to defy the very principles that held his world together. To hand her over would be to betray the woman who had brought life back into his silent house. He was trapped, and she could see the battle raging behind his stony expression. The next morning, the black buggy rolled up the long drive to the ranch house. Jasper Croft sat beside the sheriff. Lottie watched from the kitchen window, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it. The end of her brief, borrowed peace. Nate met them on the porch. He stood with his feet planted wide, his hands loose at his sides, a mountain of a man blocking the door to his home. "Callaway," the sheriff said, tipping his hat. "Mr. Croft here has a legal claim. We've come for his wife." "She's not his wife," Nate said, his voice low and even. "The paper says otherwise," Croft said, smiling a slick, unpleasant smile. He held up the document. "It's all in order. She is my property, and I've come to collect her." He looked past Nate, his eyes finding Lottie in the window. His smile widened. It was a predator's smile. Lottie couldn't breathe. She saw the agony of indecision on Nate's face. He was a man of honor, and the law was the law. She could not ask him to throw away his standing, his reputation for her. She could not be the cause of his ruin. While they argued on the porch, while Nate was caught between his conscience and the law, Lottie made her own choice. She would not be a piece of property to be fought over. Slipping out the back door, she ran to the corral. The filly, her filly, came to her instantly. With trembling hands, Lottie threw a blanket on its back and slipped a bridle over its head. There was no time for a saddle. She swung herself up onto its back, her skirts bunched around her knees. She cast one last look at the house, at the man on the porch who was fighting for her in the only way he knew how, and knew she had to save him from that fight. With a kick of her heels, she sent the filly flying across the pasture, away from the ranch, away from Nate, running back into the wilderness that had almost claimed her once before. From the porch, Nate saw the flash of movement. He saw her, a desperate figure on a bare-backed horse, fleeing toward the open range. Her flight was a physical blow. She didn't trust him to protect her. She had run to save him from the choice. He watched until she was a small speck against the vast landscape, and something inside him, the fragile, newly healed part of his heart, broke clean in two. "Well," Croft said with a smug chuckle, "the little bird has flown. No matter. She can't get far." He turned to the sheriff. "We'll track her." Nate turned to face them, and the cold fury in his eyes made both men take an involuntary step back. "Get off my land," he said, his voice a low growl that promised violence. "Now, Nate," the sheriff began, The law ends at my gate." Nate cut him off. He looked directly at Croft, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "That piece of paper you're holding is worthless here, and if you or any of your men set foot on my property again, I will consider it trespassing, and I will deal with you myself." He wasn't the respected rancher anymore. He was something older, more dangerous. He was a man defending his territory. Croft's smugness faltered. He saw that Callaway meant it. He gestured to the sheriff, and they climbed back into the buggy, turning it around in a cloud of dust. But Nate knew it wasn't over. Croft wouldn't give up that easily. He would go around Nate's authority. He would hunt her down. Nate walked back into his house. The silence was deafening. The smell of baking bread from the kitchen, the sight of the mended shirt on his chair. Every trace of her was a fresh wound. He had let her go. He had stood there, weighing options, while she had been forced to run for her life. He had failed her. The old, familiar coldness seeped back into his bones. He had lost his wife to a fever he couldn't fight. He had lost his son to a winter he couldn't warm. And now he had lost her to a hesitation he couldn't forgive. For a long, dark hour he let the despair wash over him, believing it was all over. But then, through the window, he saw chaos. The black stallion was pacing the fence line, his gaze fixed on the hills where Lahi had disappeared. The horse that would let no one else touch him was calling for her. And Nate Callaway realized he had one more choice to make. He could let the cold reclaim him, or he could fight for the woman who had thawed him out. He strode to the gun rack, took down his rifle, and walked out to the barn. He would not let his fear make him a coward again. He saddled Chaos, the horse a living embodiment of his own wild, untamed heart. The stallion accepted the saddle, accepted the rider, as if he knew their purpose was one and the same. Together, man and horse rode out, not to uphold the law, but to defy it. He was not riding after a fugitive. He was riding after the missing piece of his own soul. Lahi pushed the filly hard, her only thought to put as much distance as possible between herself and the ranch. She wasn't running from Croft anymore. She was running to protect Nate. The wilderness that had once terrified her now felt like an ally. She followed a dry wash, the high walls hiding her from view, pushing deeper into the rugged, broken country. But she had no water, no food, and the filly was beginning to tire. She didn't know that Jed, his pockets heavier with Croft's silver, was guiding her pursuers along a higher ridge, pointing out her tracks. They cornered her in a box canyon just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the rock walls in shades of blood and rust. Croft and Jed rode in, blocking the only exit. Lahi slid from the filly's back, her own back pressing against the cold stone of the canyon wall. She was trapped. "My dear Lahi," Croft said, dismounting. His smile was triumphant. "Did you really think you could escape me? You belong to me. The law says so." Lahi stood her ground. The terror was a cold knot in her stomach, but she refused to let it show. She would not beg. She would not cry. "I am not one of your possessions, Jasper." "Aren't you?" he said, taking a step toward her. Jed stayed on his horse, his rifle held loosely, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. "Your father sold you. The deal is done." It was then that they heard it. The thunder of hooves, fast and powerful. Nate appeared at the mouth of the canyon, a silhouette against the dying light, mounted on the black stallion. Chaos was a devil horse, his eyes rolling, his neck arched. Nate pulled him to a rearing halt, the rifle resting easy in the crook of his arm. "Croft!" Nate's voice echoed off the canyon walls. "I told you to stay off my land." Croft spun around, his hand going to the pistol at his belt. "This isn't your land, Callaway. This is law, and she is mine. Before Croft could draw, Chaos, loyal to the woman trapped against the wall, acted. With a wild scream, the stallion lunged not at Croft, but at Jed's horse. The horse shrieked in terror and bolted, unseating Jed, who tumbled to the ground with a cry of pain. The canyon was suddenly a storm of dust and panicked horseflesh. In that moment of confusion, Nate leveled his rifle. "Drop it, Croft." Croft, his face pale with fury, let his hand fall away from his gun. He was beaten. But it was Lottie who delivered the final, fatal blow. She stepped forward from the canyon wall, her eyes blazing. "You speak of the law, Jasper," she said, her voice clear and strong. "But you are a fraud." She reached into the bodice of her dress, into a secret pocket she had sewn into the lining years ago. She pulled out a folded, yellowed piece of paper. "This is a letter from my father, written the week before the wedding." She held it out. "He tells me in it that he refused your final offer, that he could not sell his daughter, no matter his debts. He told me to be ready to run, in case you tried to force the issue." She looked Croft dead in the eye. "The signature on your contract is a forgery. You wrote it yourself after he turned you down. You have no claim. You never did." The truth hung in the air, devastating and absolute. Croft's face collapsed, his bluff called. The legal document that was his only weapon was nothing but a lie. Nate lowered his rifle, his eyes never leaving Lottie's face. He saw not a victim, but a fighter. A woman of incredible strength who had carried the proof of her own salvation sewn into the heart of her dress. He had ridden to save her physically, but she, with her quiet courage and hidden truth, had saved them both. She had given him the moral authority to do what his heart had demanded. "Get out," Nate said to Croft, his voice flat and final. "And you," he said, turning his gaze on Jed, who was nursing a broken wrist on the ground. "You're fired. If I ever see either of you again, the sheriff will be the least of your worries." He didn't need to say more. They scrambled to leave, Croft defeated, Jed disgraced, melting back into the dusk. Silence descended on the canyon. It was just the two of them, the setting sun and the horses. Nate dismounted and walked toward her. He stopped a few feet away, his face etched with 1,000 emotions she couldn't read. "You should have told me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You would have fought for me anyway," she replied softly. "Even when you thought the law was against you. I couldn't let you do that." "I would have," he admitted. "And I would have been wrong. You didn't need a rescuer, Lottie. You just needed someone to stand beside you while you saved yourself." He closed the distance between them and his hand came up to cup her cheek. His touch was hesitant, gentle, as if he were touching something infinitely precious. "Come home," he said. It wasn't an order or a request. It was a plea. She leaned into his touch, a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees. "I am home," she whispered. He led her to Chaos, lifting her onto the stallion's back before swinging up behind her. And as they rode out of the canyon, with her leaning back against the solid warmth of his chest, the frontier no longer felt like a place to run to, but a place to put down roots. Months passed. The autumn sun slanted low across the valley, turning the prairie grass to gold. The story of Jasper Croft's forged contract and Lottie's courage had spread through the territory, silencing the gossips and earning her a quiet respect she had never sought. Mrs. Gable now offered a stiff but courteous nod when their paths crossed in town. The ranch hands, seeing the way Nate Callaway looked at her, treated her with a deference usually reserved for the lady of the house. Lottie was no longer the ghost bride. She was just Lottie. She wore sturdy denim and comfortable boots, but more than that, she wore a look of peace. The wariness in her eyes had been replaced by a soft confidence. The ranch was her home now, its rhythms as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. She had a small garden behind the house where she grew herbs, the scent of lavender and sage mingling with the dust and leather of the ranch. She stood by the corral fence now, the late afternoon sun warm on her back. The filly, no longer wild, nudged her pocket, searching for the sugar cube she knew was there. Lottie laughed and gave it to her, stroking the horse's soft nose. The fear was gone. The running was over. She heard the familiar sound of his boots on the porch steps. Nate came to stand beside her at the fence, not speaking, just sharing the comfortable silence that had become their language. He had changed too. The hard lines around his mouth had softened. He smiled more. The grief he carried for his lost family was still there, a part of him, but it was no longer a wall. It was a scar, a reminder of a love that had been, and a testament to his capacity to love again. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. It was a simple, everyday gesture now, but it still sent a thrill of warmth through her. "The far pasture," he said, his voice a low rumble as he looked out over the rolling hills. "The one with the creek running through it. It never had a proper name." She looked at him, waiting. "I was thinking of calling it Lottie's Meadow," he said, his eyes meeting hers. It wasn't a flowery declaration of love. It was something better. It was a statement of permanence. It was land and water and a place on a map. It was a root, deep in the soil. It was his whole world, and he was naming a piece of it after her. She squeezed his hand, her heart full. "I like the sound of that," she said. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. "Good," he said, "because I've already filed the deed." They stood there for a long time, watching the sunset, two solitary souls who had found their home in each other. The wild stallion, Chaos, watched them from the pasture, a silent black guardian of the peace they had fought so hard to find. The frontier was still a wild and dangerous place, but here, in the circle of his arms, Lottie was finally, irrevocably, safe. The love they found wasn't loud or flashy, but quiet and strong, like the land itself. It was built on shared work, mutual respect, and the courage to face down the past. In a world that could be harsh and unforgiving, they had created a sanctuary, a place where a runaway bride could tame a wild heart, and a broken man could learn to love again. Their story reminds us that sometimes home isn't a place you find, but a choice you make, a truth you defend, and a hand you hold as the sun goes down. Have you ever had to choose between what was safe and what was right? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed Lottie and Nate's journey, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and ring the bell for more stories of love and courage on the frontier. Thank you for listening.